Hello, and welcome to the debate with the candidates for the Legislative District 35 Senate seat, Erin Oban and Gary Emineth. I'm Robin Thorstensen, member of the League of Women Voters and the moderator. This debate has been organized by the League of Women Voters and takes place in the studios of Dakota Media Access. The debate format is as follows. Each candidate will have 60 seconds to make an opening statement, and after those opening statements, the candidates will respond to questions. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to answer the question and then have the opportunity to participate in crosstalk for up to 3 minutes. After the final question, each candidate will have 60 seconds to make a closing statement. This is intended to be a respectful exchange of ideas and to provide the candidates with an opportunity to discuss issues important to North Dakota citizens. The candidates have not received the questions in advance, and first responses to questions will be rotated between the candidates. Candidates are asked to comply with our time restrictions so that we can get to as many questions as possible. Our timer will let us know when the questions are down to 30 seconds, 10 seconds, and then finally stop. For the crosstalk segment, our timer will indicate when we are down to 1 minute and stop. So let's get to our candidates. You each have 60 seconds to make your opening statement. Erin Oban, you have the first opening statement.
Thank you, Robin, and thanks to the League of Women Voters for hosting today, and thanks to Gary for coming as well. And to those of you watching at home, I'm Erin Oban, and I am your state senator in District 35 in Bismarck. I'm running for re-election for 3 major reasons. Number 1, experience. Number 2 is engagement in the community, and number 3 is example. Over the last 4 years, I have had the experience of serving in the Senate by listening and learning and leading on behalf of our residents in District 35 and being an effective voice for you in the Senate. I've risen to positions of leadership in a short amount of time by earning the respect of my colleagues, both Republican and Democrat, and getting appointed by my Republican colleagues as the chairman of the Interim Education Committee. I am engaged in our community, whether that's in my church, in serving on volunteer roles on boards, or in standing next to parents and protecting our neighborhood schools. And last is the example that I try to set in a divisive political time, that statesmanship and compromise and working across the aisle is still an effective way to govern. I would appreciate your vote in November and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Gary Emineth, your opening statement, please.
Well, Robin, thank you very much, the League of Women Voters, for hosting this, and of course, Erin, thank you for participating. Thanks for taking time out of your busy door-to-door schedule. I saw you've got a lot of doors you've knocked on, as I have. So first of all, the reason I want to get involved running for the state Senate is I've spent most of my career in the private sector. Been in business, I've traveled 3 million miles, I've been in every state and been involved with building many companies. While there's always challenges that come in businesses and in life, just getting the opportunity at this stage of my life where my wife and I are empty nesters. I'm a husband, father, grandfather now. My granddaughter turned 6 soon. Have a son who works at Dakota Mill and Elevator, another son who just graduated from UND. And so I'm excited. My granddaughter, my daughter-in-law is just in med school at UND as well. And the future of our state and the money that's coming in is unprecedented that's happening because of the oil patch. And I think our priorities and how we spend it and where we focus our energy is going to be relevant well into the future. So excited for this time to have with Erin and chat about the issues.
Thank you. So let's dive right in with our very first question. And Gary, in your opinion, what is the number 1 issue to be addressed by the legislature in the coming session?
Well, first of all, we have a funding challenge that's ahead of us. From what I understand, the revenues are looking pretty good. I've talked to the governor's office, and it looks like our revenues are running reasonably ahead of what the projections were. Education is a very high priority for, I'm sure it is with Erin as it is with me. I think high-paying jobs, our economy, keeping that engine running and being fueled is very important. I think about how we get there and how we address those priorities are going to be important. So I think it's really a funding issue that I think is going to be relevant, that we're going to have to talk through human services. There's challenges there. The governor's done a great job leading with IT and some of the investments that are going to be required. And so I just think that it comes down to money, as it so often does, and the priority of it. I think the funding is there. It's just really a question of where those priorities are.
Thank you. Erin.
I actually have to start this debate by agreeing with Gary in that anybody who's been paying attention to the environment lately knows that the state's budget is going to be a challenge this coming session. And it's hard to narrow down one priority when I've sort of categorized it into three. And that is showing where our commitment lies with regard to the money that we do have to spend. For me, that is upholding the state's responsibility for education. That includes K-12 and an institution like BSC that has been instrumental in responding to workforce challenges. And funding education at the state level provides direct property tax relief. Number two would be human services budget. That to me includes things like behavioral health, where we have been making some progress, funding nursing homes, and continuing Medicaid expansion, which was started under the Dalrymple administration and passed by the legislature before I ever got there. And the third, for me, with regard to priorities in our budget, is public infrastructure. Public infrastructure, to me, is two things. It is bricks and mortar in our roads, sewer, water projects, and the other is the people, public infrastructure. And those are the public employees who we have a lot of in our district, and who do the hard work of, no matter what the budget situation is, providing the programs and services that people demand in an effective and efficient government.
Thank you for sharing your priorities as well. So let's have a little bit more conversation around this. Would you like to elaborate or add to or respond to some of the priorities that have been laid out?
I appreciate what Erin's done, has been a former teacher and having dealt with education. I mean, we have definitely challenges in the school. Our teachers have challenges. Our state employees haven't had a raise. I'm sure we're going to both take the position we support a pay raise for the teachers. Mm-hmm. I think there's going to be challenges as we begin to talk about budget issues. What are they going to do with benefits with the state employees? There's been talk about what's going to happen there. You know, I mean, I think that the benefits have been really critical, part of the employees' pay structure in state government. But I think we need to find ways to create innovative ideas for them to help solve problems, because we got a lot of hardworking people in state government as well as in the private sector. And how we use those funds and what we set those priorities are, you know, I think there need to be incentives in that marketplace from the private sector as well as the state employees to kind of help grow the economy, create more jobs, high-paying jobs, so the young people of our future can have a future that they can look forward to.
Erin, your thoughts about that?
Throughout, especially this last year, so since we concluded the last legislative session until, you know, the last few months, I've been in meetings at the local Chamber of Commerce trying to decide what is it that Bismarck-Mandan really needs, and are we doing an effective job as local legislators of meeting the needs of Bismarck-Mandan. And there is such a strong partnership between the public and private sector, especially here in the capital city. So we have to recognize the economic impact that the public sector has on our private sector. Obviously, the private sector is the driving force in any economy and in any community. But the public sector has a pretty significant role here in the capital. And when I sat in those meetings at the Chamber, the input that we were hearing from the private sector was directly tied to the state's ability to provide funding for projects that they need. So whether it's construction, whether it's realtors who are trying to get people into the homes that they have for sale, whether it is shortage of nursing in our hospitals. That is directly tied to the government's ability to fund things like Medicaid, which reimburses our hospitals for the work that they do.
Okay, great. Last thoughts about the topic of funding and priorities.
Well, I would just say that when it comes down to looking for solutions, I'm always going to look to the private sector, and I'm not going to tend to look to the state to solve that problem. Is there a market need? Is it something that the bureaucracy, and I respect our state employees, so I don't want to get lost in being critical of when I say the bureaucracy, but are they coming for something that they would consider that it's a want, or is it a need? You know, we have to always look at what is the priority going to be with that. And I would tend to, when it comes to voting, I have that red button or the green button, I'm going to say, is this going to restrict our liberties? Is it going to add more government? Are we going to spend more money? And I would always tend to say, can the private sector solve this first? And is it a function the government have? And I would tend to go back and say, is this within our constitutional responsibility and ability to do this? And so that's where I kind of fall in line on that.
Okay, great. Well, you actually both lead into then really a very related topic, which is, from your perspective, how do you propose balancing this budget? Because you've both indicated that we have, quite honestly, some decision making to do. In terms of what is the priority and how are we going to allocate those dollars. So how do you propose to balance the budget should you be elected? Erin?
We have been moving in the right direction with regard to being innovative and changing the way we approach things. One of those examples would be how we passed the budget for corrections and rehabilitation for the North Dakota DOCR last session. We gave them their budget, but we included some money in there that was flexible for them to work with the Department of Human Services. If we are locking people up for $45,000 to $50,000 a year, people who shouldn't be in jails but should be in a place where they're getting the help that they need, that is a better use of dollars than locking somebody up for an extended period of time. So to me, it's about spending smarter and making wiser investments for the long term. And we can't forget that we also have a legacy fund. And that legacy fund, one of my Republican colleagues from Minot, Senator Hogue, has come up with a suggestion that we start funding long-term building projects, or we make available some funding options for our locals to access that funding rather than spending out of our general fund.
Great. Thank you for that initial response. Gary, what is your initial response to this question about balancing the budget? And then we can dive into some more discussion around it.
Well, first of all, in our state budget, about 70-80% is K-12, higher ed, and human services. So if we try to go to the tower and try to nickel and dime there, we don't get anywhere very fast. So I think it's a challenge of looking where the pie's got the bigger piece where you're going to try to address it. But I think it comes down to we don't have a funding issue, we have a spending issue on where those allocations are. And we've rated the stabilization funds, we've taken the rainy day funds. Those need to be replenished to kind of go back. And I think the revenues are there. The Republicans have brought forward a proposal on infrastructure spending, which is going to be about $280 million. For Bismarck, it's about $16 million, $4 more million for the county. It's going to help keep property taxes down as far as some funding, some projects that are needed in the city of Bismarck. So I would just say we need to replenish those funds for the rainy day when it's there, and we need to look at each one of them, and each have to have their fair debate in the committee as we go forward.
Okay, great. So clearly you both have a lot of thoughts about this. So let's have a little bit more conversation. Who would like to dive in?
Well, I would just ask, Aaron, a little bit about the legacy fund. This is my position. I'm really opposed to touching that principle at all. I mean, we've taken basically all the income from the legacy fund this last session to kind of pay the bills. We're going to, that's right, interest, and we're going to need to do that probably again. But, when it comes down to the balance of it, so let's say it's $300 million, I really feel it's very strong that we take some of that and set it aside and deal with spending related to some of our priorities now, to take some of that money that's interest and think, how is it strategic? What could we invest in that's going to have a long-term effect? Because that's really what the legacy fund was there for. It's for our children and our grandchildren well into the future. And that's going to be a big bucket. And it's getting to be a lot of money, and it's only going to get a lot bigger for a long time. So I just feel very strong that we need to, I'm really against touching that principle. I want my granddaughter and my grandsons in the future to be able to have that money available for the state to continue to grow and expand.
Okay.
What I would say to that is we're already trying to make investments that are going to benefit your granddaughter and my son. My son just turned 2. Obviously, I think we both want to create the best North Dakota there can be for those 2 little ones. And when the majority of our state's budget is spent on education and human services, that's all people. Those are people. Those are investments in the very North Dakotans that we want to be here and to be living and working and playing and getting jobs and spending. At some point, we have to realize when it's raining, and when all of the pressures that the decisions we're making at the state level continue to put pressures on our locals, all that does is increase people's property taxes. And so I think there are a lot of people wondering, at what point does that legacy fund get too big? There is nobody, Democrat, Republican, Aaron Oban, somebody from Fargo, who thinks we should spend down the legacy fund. Nobody thinks that. But I do think that when we're looking at ways to better prioritize our general fund, creating more buckets for projects that could be bonded out of the legacy fund is a good idea.
Okay. Any further thoughts about this?
I'm good.
All right. Well, you both raise up some priorities and some important points, which is the education sector and also basically health, human services sector. And so let's talk about those 2 items. And let's first talk about the issue of behavioral health services. How would you propose for improving access to behavioral health services. And we'll start with you, Gary, for your initial response.
Well, I appreciate the governor and the First Lady's leadership on the opioid crises. I mean, obviously we have other issues, whether it's depression or suicide, where there's challenges in the school. It's tragic that our teachers are becoming more counselors than they are dealing with the challenges within the system. And I appreciate the fact that the legislature this last session, I think it was a House bill that came forward, and I'm not even sure, Aaron, you probably know more what was passed on, but it was $150,000 that was invested in actually in the school in our district in Simley to do some research on behavior so we can get to those challenges with those young people before. And I think it takes pressures off the administration, it takes pressures off the teachers if we can fund it. I know in Bismarck, I talked to one of the school board members who said they budgeted $1.5 million for counselors in the school to help support the program. And I think there needs to be some money set aside outside of funding related to that as well.
Great. Aaron, same question. How would you propose improving access to behavioral health services?
So the nice thing to respond to that question, Robin, is we don't have to invent it. A few years ago, the legislature commissioned a study that created a report called the Schulte Report, and it came up with probably about 15 recommendations to respond to the gaps in North Dakota with regard to behavioral health. And just so everybody understands what behavioral health means, that's mental health and substance abuse, addiction, and responding to that with recovery. And it is so clear to me that we are taking steps in the right direction, but we need to have the will to actually do what is in that report that was studied and outlined by an outside source. It wasn't partisanship. Democrats and Republicans generally agree on this. It's just whether or not we have the will to do the recommendations that were laid in front of us. Because this really is a crisis in our communities. And I don't use the word crises very casually. I've heard this from families at their doorsteps. I've heard this in our schools. I've heard this in our workforce, and I've heard this with law enforcement.
Great. Well, you both raised some very good points. So how do you all propose actually implementing the actual steps that were recommended?
This is really a partnership between the private and public sector. So our human services centers are the publicly funded option for people to access these services. I think there needs to be a much greater partnership with our human service centers and our educators. Those are worlds that are mostly covered by public funds. Why aren't they talking more? Why aren't they working more closely together? And here in Bismarck, we do have examples of where that's coming together, both at Simley and at Dorothy Moses Elementary School. So we have some really good, thoughtful, forward-thinking leaders right here locally that are making examples for other people across the state to cover it. And then there are projects that are coming up all over the state, like the F5 project, where I have referred people right here in our district for supports, for people who are trying to be in recovery, for people who are coming out of incarceration, who need some supports around them to get into the workforce, to start making some money so they can pay some taxes, so they can get a roof over their head, pay their bills. These are the kinds of things where really the public and private sector are going to work very closely together.
And I talked to the governor's office about this. I understand there's a survey coming out through all the state departments, the state employee department heads to say, hey, as it relates like to opioid, what are you doing? And so that there can be some consolidation so we can create some efficiencies so we aren't have every little department doing something different. And I was at a recent conference where Pam Sagnas was speaking, and she was talking about the challenges of recovery, so that we don't have really a good communication between private and public when people come out of an addiction treatment. We don't really do a good handing of the baton as we move them to the next level, and I think the state needs to look at that. I think there's been strides made, but the crisis is real, and it needs to be funded, and it's going to take some talent and patience by a lot of people to get us there.
Great.
Can I add one last thing on that? And that's that I hope we can get to a point where we're no longer responding to something and we're preventing it. Because we know that spending money on the front end in prevention and intervention is a much better use of dollars, and it literally saves lives.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that topic. So let's shift gears a little bit to something completely different. Let's talk about voter registration. So voting centers, basically centralized locations where citizens could cast their vote regardless of where their address actually is, has been proposed in the past for Burleigh County. there's also a lot of discussion around voting registration and that voter registration should change and in some ways. What are your thoughts about that? And I believe first response is yours, Erin.
Sure. So the voting center issue was pretty interesting. I was invited as one of two legislators here in Bismarck to be a part of that kind of focus group with the Burleigh County Auditor to talk about whether or not we should consolidate a bunch of voting locations and get voters to just a handful of locations here in Bismarck-Mandan. And there was some support around the group, there was some opposition. And what I did was take that information and share it with all of my legislative colleagues here in Bismarck-Mandan. And I said, what do you think? Specifically Bismarck, since this was Burleigh County. And universally, they were opposed. So me, the only Democratic legislator here in Bismarck, sat next to all of my Republican colleagues, and we worked with the auditor to say, we will help you get the volunteers and the staff you need to keep these locations open. But to consolidate into just one or two three locations is not when we're trying to get voters to actually go to the polls and participate in our elections, limiting the locations is not a good way to do that.
Okay. Your response, Gary, to that discussion?
Yeah, about half the state, at least in geography and probably more, vote by mail. You know, and the only place you vote on election day is at the courthouse, and for some that's a long drive. You know, we don't really have voting issues here today related to voter fraud, and I think accessibility and encouraging people to get to the polls and vote. I think the reality of having an ID and encouraging people to, you know, to have that in place is the right way to do it. If it's an issue with people, we ought to fund it if they have a problem with an ID, but accessibility and options, I'm for all. I mean, we need more participation in our republic, not less. And the more we can do to encourage that, I'm all for.
Okay, great. So any further thoughts from either of you regarding voters registration, should that topic come up again?
As the only state that doesn't have voter registration, I think it's in our best interest to figure out what are the pros and cons of that. And for a number of interim sessions, the legislature has studied that issue. And oftentimes the study is just bringing forth a few people who share the perspective of maybe who the chairman happens to be. That's not a study. That's not being willing to look at the information. What I want is the same thing Gary wants, and that's more participation in our elections.
Yeah, and it's really a cost issue. If we go to voter registration, you end up leaving people out as opposed to encouraging people, because you got to get 30 days out, you got to get registered. We spend all of our energy getting people registered. You know, my life would be a lot easier as a candidate, and Erin would too, if she had a list of her Democrats and my Republicans, and we could do that. I would be all for that. However, North Dakotans have consistently said we don't want voter registration, and we're a low population state. We're pretty, you know, hardworking, just honest people. I don't think we got a problem. And we kind of go back and forth, and you know, people say there's voter suppression, and Republicans are out to get the, you know, people that are on the reservation, and I just don't see that at all from my Republican. As a former party chairman, you know, I just don't see that being a big issue at this point.
I think it's important to recognize the very real challenges there is of our North Dakotans who are living on Indian reservations, though. They have not had a system by which they have had physical addresses. They have identified with P.O. boxes for a very long time in rural routes. And so it's important that if this is going to be the law, we do everything we can to make sure people understand the law, comply with the law, and get to the polls.
Well, and I think most of the people on the reservation probably have a driver's license. I mean, there's a good place to start, but we need to create a vehicle to support that, to encourage participation on the reservations. I totally, they're 100%.
Wonderful. The League of Women Voters always appreciates people who want to get people to the polls. That's awesome. So let's shift gears yet again, and let's talk a little bit about our rural EMT and ambulance systems. As you all know, there is concern throughout the state that our rural communities are struggling to have first responders. So what ideas do you have for boosting our rural EMT and ambulance systems, that first responder system? And first response goes to you, Gary.
Well, I grew up in Washburn, a small community 40 miles from here, and you know, we operate with a volunteer ambulance and volunteer fire department. There might be a point in time where the state's going to have to do something to provide some type of benefits, whether there's some insurance or whether there's some incentives for people to move beyond volunteers, because that service is critical. I had a father who died from a heart attack, and consequently, I mean, the ambulance service was there, they could, but you're 40 miles away from Bismarck, and getting the ambulance to Bismarck, there's always those challenges in rural health. And so I think that needs to be looked at. I don't have a specific other than to say that I'm very thankful for the volunteers that serve in this capacity. I know a number of them that do, and it's a necessary, and it's a tough situation with our, and I support the whole idea of Measure 4 that we're doing to give some incentive with the license plates and going to the parks. It's going to cost us some money, but it's a great service those people play.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gary. Aaron, your response to how do we boost access to rural EMTs and ambulance systems?
Sure. So one thing I feel like Bismarck is a city built up of a bunch of people who moved here from small towns.
Yeah.
I grew up in a small town in northwest North Dakota, and during the oil boom, obviously that put a huge strain on emergency responders, and most of those emergency responders are volunteers in our small communities. There are two major ways, I think, so far that the state has not responded to the real need that community has been asking for. Number one is a communication and radio service that reaches all across the state. They asked for funding for that last session. To me, that's something that leaves a legacy. If that is something that we can respond to, that better serves our small rural communities and doesn't force them to increase local property taxes, I think that's a pretty fair responsibility to accept on the state. And the other is something as what should be simple is covering injuries for volunteer emergency responders under WSI.
Okay. So we have a little bit of time to discuss this a little bit further. Any additional thoughts that you have that you would like to throw out there on this topic, or should we move on to the next question?
I'm ready to move on.
Yeah, we can
Okay.
move on. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. The North Dakota Association of Counties has voted to support a resolution to eliminate the farm home exemption. So what is your position on the farm home exemption and the fact that there is some differences in how we tax ag property versus residential property? And Aaron, you have first response.
To talk about that issue right now, in the midst of really challenging conversations we're having on the pressures that are being put on our farmers and ranchers at the national level, I'm not sure that this discussion would go very far. Obviously, the way this impacts rural North Dakota is different than it is as urban of a district as Bismarck can be considered. So what I do in situations like this is I sit down and have conversations with the people who are most impacted. And that would be county leaders, that would be local community leaders, local school boards, so that I can hear what are those impacts if we were to exempt that at the state level to the people who have to live with the impacts.
Great. Gary, your thoughts about this?
Well, while I'm a big proponent in energy development and all the jobs and the wealth that's created for many people and put money in the state's coffers, agriculture is still our big one. And if we have any problem, it's a lot of these small farms where young people are deciding, I'm not going to live. They want to go to the urban life, and that's how they end up in Bismarck. You know, they want to have, or Fargo, they want a life that's got a little bit more action. Anything we can do to encourage our young people that are second, third generation to stay at home and live on the ranch or the farm, I'm all for, because it's a way of life that we need to preserve in North Dakota. We need to encourage it, and it'd be a tragedy if we lose that part of it, because as the family farms shrink in the quantities around the country, I think it's having a negative effect on our country, our lifestyles, and just family life.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And that brings up yet another question, and that has to do with corporate farming. You mentioned family farms. You pointed that out as well. Corporate farming has come to North Dakota. And so what is your position regarding the growth and development of corporate farming within North Dakota? And do you feel that the legislature should do something different? And we will start with you, Gary.
That my question, or is it just a response of our?
It's a question, so you'll get initial response.
Well, here, what I would say is I've been a big proponent of some of the measures that Farm Bureau has brought forward. A great organization. And personally, the corporate farming, I wouldn't use the word farming, but was with the dairies. I personally supported it. I thought it was an important thing to do to encourage more dairy farms to grow in North Dakota. And I thought it was reasonably limited in scope. Now, I understand Farm Bureau took a much more aggressive position and took to defeat it. So I would be contrary to what public opinion was on it. I thought it was a good thing. I went out and visited a couple dairy farms with a gentleman that does a lot of dairy maintenance. And there's a lot of pressure on certain segments where you see a lot of people either raising hogs or milking more cattle in different parts of the country, whether it's Iowa or Nebraska. And when I saw it, I just saw there was some real merit in it. But I think sometimes we all panic over corporate farming, like the big corporations are going to come in and take over. I just don't think the economies are there. And I just don't see it being a thing that's going to take over and change the way our lifestyles in North Dakota.
Okay. Erin, what's your thoughts about corporate farming?
Well, one thing that you will learn about me if you haven't already is that I'm not an alarmist about much of anything. I don't think that knee-jerk responses are healthy in a debate and a discussion. And so I think to categorize this as a panic might have been a bit of a stretch. I am a lifelong Farmers Union member, and I was on the committee when the legislature passed overturning part of that corporate farming law. And I was one in the minority of that vote. The legislature passed it. The people referred it. And overwhelmingly, the public supported keeping what we currently have in law to protect family farms. I understand some of the challenges that are coming, especially with automation and with trying to keep up with changes in technology. But family farms are the backbone of our state and really of our country. And I thought keeping what we had in place was important.
Great. What other thoughts do you have about this topic of agriculture and corporate farming, or even taxation?
I guess what the quality of life that happens in rural North Dakota, it's changing. There's no question. Young people aren't wanting to be on the farm. So I'm like I said earlier, I think it's great to do all we can to encourage it. I think there's people get a little carried away when somebody wants to set up an LLC for tax purposes so they can pass that farm on to the next generation. The land values are high. We're talking lots of dollars, and sometimes I think there could be some creative ways to have some discussions. It's just that when we bring up corporate farming, people overreact sometimes. I'm not saying Erin is, but I just think sometimes we use it as a straw man to put hindrance to change that's required, because we're in a very competitive marketplace worldwide, whether we're selling oil, we're selling grain around the world. And as the world picks up and the economy picks up and these third world countries become competitive, if we aren't selling our goods to market, that has huge impacts on everything. Right down to Main Street when I'm selling a plow, if that's my business. And so it has impacts up and down all over the state. And I think we have to be creative, encourage innovation, and farming without question has done that. And anything we can do to kind of foster that, that's where I would end up.
Erin, any last thoughts?
I guess I was proud to have stood with the majority of North Dakotans, and actually, that case was taken to court and challenged, and the court upheld the position that I had in the legislature that the people had at the polls.
Wonderful. Thank you. So let's talk about your assessment of the governance of the North Dakota University system, which seems to come up every session. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts about the governance of the university system.
Am I first?
You are first, Gary.
Well, first of all, we might be at a point in our history where we pay people to serve on this board. I mean, we have people that have stepped down because of the burden and the time it takes for someone to be, they get a stipend, but I mean, it's a huge pressure. We're talking $1 billion industry. And I'm not so sure that the governor shouldn't allow, these people shouldn't serve totally at the governor's pleasure. If there's a problem and he needs to get rid of somebody, I think at least we have the ballot box that we can deal with. If we don't like what a governor does on that board, maybe there's a point in time that maybe they should serve at the governor's pleasure. And if we don't like what the governor does and he gets rid of somebody, we can go to the ballot box and vote against the governor. But I am very concerned because of the pressure and the time commitment that's required of people to serve on the board. While it's great for those that have interest in doing it, it's a big commitment and I think I don't know what that number ought to be. I haven't been in the legislature working with the numbers on higher ed, but I'm very concerned what we're asking the people to serve on the board. It's a problem, and that's why I think it's run amok, because administrators are forced to, bring all this stuff forward.
Okay. Erin, your response. What's your assessment of the university system governance?
We have an interesting dynamic in North Dakota with all of the institutions we have. We have the two research universities in eastern North Dakota. We have just a beacon, in my opinion, in a place like BSC, Minot State, over in Williston, Dickinson. And then we have some of our smaller places like Valley City, Mayville, Bottineau. I apologize if I left any out. It's a challenge to be able to respond to the needs and requests of institutions of such varying different sizes and scopes of what they do. And so I've had conversations with our BSC president about the conversations that are happening in the governor's task force on the governance of higher ed, And I wanted him to share with me, as somebody who served as the interim chancellor and somebody who serves as the president of a 2-year here in our community, what are the benefits and what are the challenges of changing the governance, whether it's creating 2 different boards or whether it's trying to make the board that we have more effective and not put such demands on volunteers, essentially.
Okay, great. Any further thoughts about the university system?
Well, I would just say that, I mean, we have a lot of schools, and they all have their turfs to protect, and it's split up geographically so everybody can protect and do horse trading at the legislature. And I think it's a little bit unfortunate that we have, while they're all serve needs in those communities, it's just very expensive. And I think the idea of having a single board I think sometimes we put our students at jeopardy who might make a decision to go to BSc, and all of a sudden, if you separate it and you just had UND and NDSU isolated, they would begin to protect their turf. And pretty soon a student gets caught in the crossfire of that. And I just would struggle over having 2 boards where when you get that geography and that turf protection that they do, that's going to be a problem and jeopardize our students who now have spent 30, 40, 50, 60,000 getting out of college, don't have a degree lined up for a job that's needed to be filled. And I worry about the university system without, them working underneath one system, so they're thinking of the student first.
I forgot Wahpeton, one of the best trade schools we have here. And so I was thinking about those responses to workforce needs and the ability for our 2 years to be much more responsive and flexible in how we provide programming and get students in and out the door. One of the things we need to do, and that I know the universities have grappled with, is allowing kids who are in the K-12 setting to be taking college credits before they ever get to college, before they have to take on that student loan and leave with debt. I think it's better for all of us to provide those opportunities to schools large and small across North Dakota.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think from the public school side of it, to prepare those students for vocational, whether it's welding. I have a son that said, Dad, I'm not going to college under any circumstances. And I said, that's your choice. You're going to, there's maybe consequences. He's doing great without it. His wife's in med school, being a doctor. Maybe he'll be all right with that. But in the end, preparing for some of the young people that make those choices, we can do better to prepare them from a technical standpoint to line up the jobs in the oil patch, or what are the jobs that allow our young people to stay here in North Dakota. Because, as a parent, Aaron's got a young one as well, and I got 2 that weren't as empty nesters. We want them to be here so I can see my granddaughter and my grandsons in the future be around us. And so aligning those skills so they can stay here through our high school and our university system is very important.
Great. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. So what role should the state legislature play in sustaining quality and equitable K-12 education? And we're going to start with Aaron.
Okay. The legislature took on a pretty hefty responsibility about 10 years ago when they restructured the funding of K-12 education in an effort to try to respond to the pressures that were being put on locals and a court case that was brought forward to try to balance out inequities in education across our state. The state decided they would take on 70 to 80% of the funding of K-12 education. They did that in the last couple years, obviously. I don't know that we are upholding that obligation, which only puts more pressure on property taxes. However, I don't think we are going to be able to make great strides in equity of education until we all realize that we have to meet the needs of the whole child. And that responsibility can't fully fall on the shoulders of teachers. And until we meet basic needs like clothing and food, and behavioral health needs, and stability and parent engagement, we won't get there on our own.
Thank you. Gary.
Well, I would just say from education standpoint, I just feel it's very strong to be parent and child-centric. Here in Bismarck, we got great, the Catholic school system for parochial, we got Shiloh, we got parents that homeschool, and even the Catholic school here in Bismarck is making a $40-some million investment in a campus north of Bismarck. We need to encourage the collaboration sometimes between public and private. And while there's always need for more funding and classroom size. There's theories out that we need smaller, we need largers are okay. Some of that needs to be worked out but I feel strong with the local control, allowing the school boards to make those decisions locally, and the state needing to fund it to support it. we don't in Bismarck have the right idea of what should happen in Bowman versus Washburn versus Bismarck or Fargo. It's best to have that local control and put the funding level where it needs to be as a generic, but let them make those local decisions.
Okay. Additional thoughts?
Well, you asked what the state's role is, and I think the state's role is to uphold its commitments and then to structure our programs at a state level and the services we provide to our schools, to our parents, to our families, whether it's in public education or out, to best serve the kids. And it has been really the very fulfilling work that I've done over the last 4 years and becoming a leader in the Senate in K-12 education. And I think because of my background as a teacher, my experience as a private school teacher and as I attended a private university and as a public school student, to realize that we're serving a lot of kids and our job is to serve them as best we can. And so being the chair of an interim committee and leading those discussions, having a seat in the governor's office as we talk about restructuring things at the K-12, at the state level on K-12 education, and influencing policy in the Senate on education has been really fulfilling work for me. And then as a parent here in the community, protecting our neighborhood schools that we care so much about.
Right, and I would just add from a funding level that I think Republicans have stepped forward, going back to Governor Hoeven on funding of education related to teachers and pushing that ball forward down. And I think it's taken pressure off the property taxes. And so I think Republican leadership has done a good job with that. And I would just continue to support those funding levels like that. But I really believe that's strong with that local control. I like the idea of having local involvement funding because that really drives closer access to the school board, taxpayers, parents, children.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And of course, that leads us to the all-important question around property taxes, because both of you brought it up. So, how do you feel that the state budget should impact property taxes this coming session? And we'll start with you, Gary.
Well, I mean, obviously there was a bill that changed everything this last session where Republicans have spent a lot of money. I think it's $1.2 billion in property tax buy down. At the end of the day, the state shouldn't be in the property tax business. It's really a local issue that drives it. However, when they brought forward funding of the county social services and bringing some of that on, I'm worried about that slippery slope that those dollars just continue to grow because there's a need out there without question. And I like the idea of the property taxes being close, local, school boards, city commissioners holding them accountable because the people run into them every day. And so while there's been the buy down, philosophically I have concerns that that's really the right way to approach it, where we put money at it, because if we tie in and use all that oil money for some of the local things like that and we get our funding as opposed to having multiple sources of a broad-based tax base to support this, that really kind of establishes volatility and risk, budget crises problems.
Aaron, your response to how should the legislature impact property taxes this session?
Legislators will be the first to tell you that they don't have any influence on property taxes. And I think that is a bit of a fallacy that they want to give people as a way to cop out of their responsibilities, from my perspective. Legislators, to be clear, do not levy and do not spend property taxes. But what we do at the state level significantly impacts what locals do with property taxes. And so I am a firm believer in the three-legged stool that we talk about in North Dakota all the time, and that's sales tax, income tax, and property taxes. There's been discussion about eliminating income taxes at the state level, and I think all that's going to do is completely throw that stool out of whack and tip it over. So what we've been doing at the state level, before I got there, certainly before you're trying to get there, is increase spending and then decreasing stable revenues at the state level that can make our budget sustainable. I'm all for right-sizing government. I'm all for reasonable taxes. But when we throw those things out of whack, what happens is property taxes increase. And my responsibility as a legislator is to make sure that our revenues at the state level don't put pressures on local property taxes.
So let's talk about that a little bit more in terms of property taxes versus sales tax versus income tax. Your thoughts about that?
Well, there's no question this three-legged stool has been the policy of what we've done. What I'm concerned about is of becoming so dependent and spending money that we make long-term commitments financially to whatever agency, whatever department is, and whatever it is with the taxpayer, that we tie it to the volatility of oil, which is what's happened, or commodity agriculture. And when we hit the speed bump, that creates a problem for us. Now all of a sudden we're cutting, and there's this whiplash effect, and people are hurting that. And so the idea of having that three-legged stool across broad basic, yes, I think that's great. But the idea of it is, if you do cut taxes, you do have growth. Economic growth comes from most of those instances. A lot of times you got to work through what is that right number. But Republicans have cut income tax 3 times in the last 10 years. There's a lot of money has been saved at that. We still have plenty of money to go around. It's a spending issue, and from my perspective, it's not a tax issue, and it's working through the priorities in those spending levels that we have to deal with. That's what the legislators do.
Erin, any response to that?
If you ask the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and the Grand Forks Herald did ask him that, he said they went too far. They got a little happy when times were good in North Dakota, and I think they made some decisions, this was again before I got there, that are going to make it really challenging in the long term to not rely more on commodity prices that we can't control. And so when our state is so much dominated by agriculture and energy prices, responsible financial, fiscal management means you don't do this with spending at the same time you're doing this with revenues. And you realize that when you're looking at this long term, you need to have a holistic look at it, and that is a balanced tax structure. You don't have Democrats, Republicans, I don't care what party you are, nobody likes taxes. Nobody wants to increase your taxes. But we all like the things like schools and law enforcement and roads that those tax dollars provide.
Last thoughts?
I'm good.
All right. So we're going to move on to our very last 2 questions. And so our next question is, what changes do you foresee for the state's budget section? Basically, what changes do we see for the legislature coming up? And I believe we start with you.
So this interim, I was elected to serve on the Legislative Management Committee. And the Legislative Management Committee is a makeup of Republicans and Democrats from the Senate and from the House who kind of lead the interim work when the legislature is not in session. One of those committees that we appoint members to is the Budget Committee. Now, when legislative management was faced with some vetoes that the governor had made, we actually talked about that on air on the radio, Gary, one of the responses the governor had was to challenge the authority of the budget section. And actually, that is a position that our former senator has taken in this district, is challenging that authority. There are so many legislators who make up the budget section, and they are not representative of the people who elect. It's not equal representation like the legislature is made up of, where every district gets 1 senator and 2 House members. That's not the makeup of the budget section, and I think they have gotten more and more authority. If it means we can't respond to the challenges of North Dakota with the setup we have with legislative sessions every 2 years, then we're going to have to look at whether or not the budget section is the right way to do that.
I'm not trying to get lost in the weeds and the nuances and the semantics of how the budget stuff works with Aaron did. So that's out of my league at this point, but I will say this. I think we know by law we have to balance the budget. I appreciate the Republican leading forward in this infrastructure spending bill that's going to bring about $20 million to Bismarck-Mandan. It's a $280 million bucket. I do have some philosophical concerns over the bucket approach. I appreciate the fact that it goes into a block, but what happens is it seems like that money's already earmarked and it sits in those funds, and we don't have good debate. It's almost like a block grant sometimes. And I mean, for expediency, I appreciate the fact that we have to do it. And sometimes when it goes into a bucket and it gets distributed locally, they have a better feel for it. But I'd like transparency. If we can have more rigorous debate, that would happen. That's where it's at, is on the transparency side, so we can get more input in that regard.
Any further thoughts regarding the budget section and the changes you anticipate this coming session?
What I'm most concerned about is the way we have dealt with challenging budget times across the board cuts in the middle of interim sessions. Any family who's faced with that decision does not make across the board cuts. And that's the system we've created. So we need to be able to better respond to these kinds of situations. And I don't think the budget section is the best way to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. Last question before we go to our closing statements, which is, if elected, what do you hope to accomplish this biennium? We'll start with you, Gary.
Well, first of all, I'd like to move towards a a stimulated environment where we encourage innovation, investment, and we'd encourage people from the private sector to be engaged in the process. And so when Erin talks about public and private engagement, that's very true. However, I would like us to think about how do we grow this economy so that young families can benefit from it, so young people can stay here. So for my priority, I would always want to be thinking about is how do we grow this economy to create jobs for the people across the state so our young people can stay here, they have a long-term future. I don't want to tap into our principal and all the side of our legacy fund. I think the money's there to do it. But I would see it as a priority to have transparency. There can be good, robust discussion on what the priorities ought to be going forward.
Wonderful, thank you. Erin, what do you hope to accomplish this biennium if elected?
I had outlined the priorities earlier that I think best deserve my focus as a senator. That is to uphold the state's commitment to funding education, whether that's K-12 or whether that's at BSc. The next would be human services budget that meets the needs of people, especially in behavioral health. And the last one would be in public infrastructure. So as Gary has mentioned, about $280 million worth of need here in Bismarck-Mandan. Roads are not the only thing we need. We need the people to do it. And that includes taking care of our public employees who live right here in District 35 and not protecting their jobs for the sake of their jobs. It's the work that they do, the services they provide, the demands that people have on what public infrastructure is supposed to provide. So those would be my priorities.
Great, thank you. And we will go to closing statements. And since Erin had first opening statement, Gary, you may begin with your closing statement.
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting this. Erin, thank you for spending this time here to talk through some of these issues. You know, having spent most of my life in the private sector and working and creating jobs and having been a part of multiple companies and traveled around the world doing that, while I've had ups and downs, challenges, and I'm sure that my opponent will want to talk about some of those as we go forward to the campaign, but the reality is you sometimes take things on the chin, and when you get involved in the private sector and business, you have to work through challenges. Sometimes there are good times, sometimes there's hard times, and so from my perspective, you know, serving in the legislature and the budget stuff going through, I think I got a lot of the real world experiences that are going to play out well serving this state as a state legislator.
Thank you. Erin, your closing statement.
It's been an honor to be the senator for District 35 for the last 4 years. And we all bring a level of real world experience in the perspectives that we bring. That perspective might be in business, but we also need that perspective from education, from healthcare, from nonprofit work, from blue collar workers. The perspectives that we need to hear in the legislature include a variety of different voices, and it's been an honor to be the voice for District 35. I look forward to bringing my experience and my example and the level of engagement that I brought to this community back to the North Dakota Senate after November. Thank you.
Our thanks to the candidates and to the League of Women Voters and Dakota Media Access for organizing this conversation. This recorded program will air on Government Access Cable Channels 2 and 602 HD in the days leading up to the November 6th election, and will be available also online at www.freetv.org. Before we close, we would like to remind you that you will need a form of identification to vote in North Dakota. You can find identification requirements and additional voting information on the websites or at the office of your county auditor and the North Dakota Secretary of State. Thank you and good night.